Hi, I'm Martin Posiask. I'm the Communications Director and Editor for Helicopter Association International, and I'm here at Heli Expo 2009 in Anaheim, California, and I'm interviewing a helicopter pioneer, Ozzie York. And Ozzie, where were you born?
I was born in Winston County, Alabama. Winston County is known as the Free State of Winston. I understand it was the only county that didn't secede from the Union during the Civil War.
And where do you currently live?
And currently I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Do you have any brothers or sisters?
I have two sisters, both younger than I am. I don't have a brother.
And where do your sisters live?
And my sisters live in Foley, Alabama. They live side by side in a house that they each own.
Okay, great. And can you tell me a little bit about your education?
Well, I went to school originally in Indianapolis, Indiana. I don't remember the exact school, but went through grammar school there through the 6th grade. And then my family moved to Foley, Alabama on a little farm. And I finished high school in Foley.
Great. And you've had a long association with Helicopter Association International. And back then it was HAA, Helicopter Association of America. And back then you also served on the board of directors as treasurer. And can you talk about that?
That's a long time ago, but I don't remember exactly when we joined the
Well,
association.
Eleanor Rudnick Falk was...
Jim Rickless and some other people formed an association out in California, and then they made some agreements to make meetings with the different helicopter companies that were operating it back in those days. And I can't remember which was the first one that I attended, but we went to Bell several times, and we went up into Philadelphia, and also out and went out to Hiller for a convention out there. And I don't remember where we were when I became treasurer, but I had been, I think, to 2 conventions prior to that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember exactly where they were.
Who was president at the time?
I'd have to look it up. I don't remember.
Wasn't it Eleanor Rudnick?
Well, Eleanor was the one that became president the year that I became secretary or became treasurer. But
that'd be Eleanor Rudnick.
Eleanor
Falk,
Rudnick,
right?
Yes.
And
yes, she wasn't a Falk then.
No. Okay. And who was secretary?
I would think Joe Seward might have been when we had the meeting originally, and then Eleanor was elected for the following term.
And who was secretary at the time?
And secretary was Donna Larson.
It was a much smaller organization back then, wasn't it?
Very, very much smaller. We could fit the whole group in a hotel room.
And what were the dues?
I believe the dues were $10 a year.
That was a real bargain back
It was a
then.
real bargain then. Yeah, I remember getting a letter from Red Jansen when I wrote him a letter to collect the dues.
Right. And you're here at Heli Expo 2009, and we have record attendance here, and it's so much bigger, and you're still a big part of this. You still come to every show, and
Well, in the early days I came, and then I got busy, and there's quite a few years that I was not able to attend, but then when it got so that I could, I've been coming every year.
Good, good. All right, let's go back in time. You went to college. Where was that?
I went to college in Auburn, Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
They used to call it the Alabama Polytechnic Institute. But everybody knows it at Auburn anymore.
What were you studying?
I don't remember. We had a ROTC unit at that school at that time that was connected to the artillery. Mm-hmm. And so I had some classes in that, and I was taking animal husbandry and algebra and English and some other stuff. Mm-hmm. I don't remember. That's a long time ago, too long ago.
You left college in 1941 to join the Canadian Air Force.
No, I left college after that 1 year and went to work in Pensacola trying to make some more money to go back to college. And during that time, I went up to Montgomery, Alabama, and took a took a physical, which I didn't pass, and took a written test. And then I went back to work since I couldn't get into the Army Air Corps. And a kid that I had roomed with in Auburn had joined the Army Air Force as a pilot and was about to graduate down in Randolph Field. And for some reason or other, he got washed out. And during that time, there was a Clayton Knight Committee that was recruiting people to go over to England and join the RAF because they needed a lot of pilots. And Victor knew that I had tried to join the Army Air Corps, and he asked me if I would go with him to Canada. So I drove up to, I had an old 1935 Ford, and I drove up to Selma and met Victor, and we drove up to Canada to join the Canadian Air Force. And they were, of course, happy to see us. They were recruiting a lot of people to go over to Britain and fight the war back in those days. And since they needed bodies, and I think I didn't have any trouble getting in there or being recruited at that time.
So did you, where did you learn to fly?
And I learned to fly in the Canadian Air Force. Of course, they had everybody they could recruit, and had quite a few people lined up for training, and so we did a lot of ground school and stuff like that in the beginning, and then they sent me to St. Eugene, Ontario for primary training, and I flew Canadian fleets. And during that time, the United States then sent a train across Canada to try to get some of the people that had joined the Canadian Air Force to see if they would want to transfer back to the United States. That was the first legal opportunity we had. Apparently some of the people had gone AWOL to come back to the United States after Pearl Harbor. And so I went up to Montreal and to see if I could transfer back, and tried to get in the Navy then. I was interested in the Navy because I had lived in Foley, Alabama, which is 28 miles from Pensacola, and saw all those Navy pilots flying down there, and it created a lot of interest. And I couldn't pass the Navy physical either. They turned me down. So I thought, well, I'll see if the Army Air Corps will take me, and I went to see their doctors, and they decided they would take me. And then I asked them how long it would be before I would get to start flying. And they said, well, to get through the pipeline with all the people they were recruiting and the services that they had, it'd probably be 6 or 7 months. And I said, since I was already flying with the Canadians, I just stay where I was. And I went back then and finished my training with the Canadians, went up to Moncton, New Brunswick, and finished advanced training. And the class that I was in Moncton, they pretty much split down the middle and spent half the pilots went to Beaufighters and the other half to Spitfires, except 6 of us they sent to flight training school and made instructors out of us.
So you didn't see any action, actually, right?
I didn't see any action and never saw any combat all my time in the service. I spent 5.5 years altogether.
As a flight instructor, pretty much.
And pretty much as, well, all the time I spent in Canada was as a flight instructor. Mm-hmm. And then in 1944, I got a chance to transfer back to the United States Air Force, and came back then and reported to Romulus, Michigan, in the Ferry Command in January 1945. And
okay. How did you come in contact with helicopters?
Oh, I didn't come in contact with helicopters until much time after the war was over, because well, you've interrupted my train of thought.
How about when you first soloed in a helicopter?
Well, that's quite a time later. I did a lot of stuff before I got at that point.
Okay.
When I went to, or I transferred to the U.S. Army Air Corps, was in the Ferry Command, they sent me through some ground school on B-24s, B-17s, and P-63s, and P-47s. But I didn't get to fly any of those airplanes. C-47 and C-46s. I did some co-pilot flying on ferrying C-46s, and then I took a instrument course and AT-7s in Romulus, and occasionally went over and with a flight engineer and ferried a B-24 or taxied a B-24 across the field from where they built it, where Ford was building it there at Willow Run, to where the Air Force took charge of it across the field. And that's the closest I ever got to flying a B-24. I did several of those. And I ferried some C-46s out of Buffalo, New York to Fort Wayne, Indiana, where they would do rework on them for some reason or other. And then shortly after that, they sent me to St. Joe, Missouri, and I went through C-46 school there, and to get prepared to go overseas. And then I went over to Europe. I was based in Bovington, which was not too far outside of London, which was an 8th Air Force base, but I was part of ATC at that time. And flew C-47s and C-64s from England up to Ireland. We were flying material out of a B-24 repair depot up there that they were shutting down since the war was just about over, and bringing that stuff into London. And we were also flying over to Paris in a C-47. And after about 6 months in that area, I was transferred to Paris and flew. And the war had ended at that time with the Germans, and then we were flying all to various bases in Europe. And
how did your career take you to helicopters?
then after I came back out of the service in 1946, I couldn't get a flying job, so I wound up then going to Spartan to get an A&P license. And after I finished that, I went to work, or got a job flying for Stewart Sales Corporation in Indianapolis, Indiana. And the fellow I worked for in Indianapolis also owned a P-39 that Tex Johnson had won the Thompson Trophy race in Cleveland in 1946, and he had gotten a machine from Bell Aircraft and had raced it in 1947, and that's when I had gone to work for him, and we were trying to get it ready in 1948, and I had gone up to Bell to get an engine and get some information on what they had done to that machine, since they never made any written documents on any, or had any data on what they had actually done to make it a racer. And during that time, they of course tried to sell the helicopter to Rollins Stewart. And eventually, in February 1948, he bought his first one, and that was the first helicopter that I'd gotten a ride in, but I didn't get any training at that time until later on. And he bought a second helicopter then in the summer of 48, and they were using it for ag work, spraying corn up in Wisconsin and various places. I know I had flown Stewart up there in a Staggerwing Beach for several times. And then after they finished the season, it was back in Indianapolis, and Stewart then asked that helicopter pilot to give me a little time in that Bell 47, and I flew with a pilot by the name of Bob Gangwish at that time, and I guess I got a couple of flights in it, probably about an hour and 45 minutes altogether, something like that. And so I soloed the thing and flew it around the pattern, and didn't fly a helicopter until much later, but that's the first time I flew one. And the next spring, Stewart got a contract in Alaska for 2 machines, and he couldn't find anybody to go up there. He had found some people to go, and apparently one crew backed out on him, and he finally asked me if I would go up there, and he sent me to Bell to take a maintenance course on the 47, so that the insurance company would cover his machines, And we went to Alaska and spent the whole summer of Alaska with the USGS. And when I came back from Alaska, he had sold the machines to Roy David and Ed McGee out of New Orleans. And they were in business with a C-54 flying cargo to Central and South America. And Stewart had a fellow that was kind of running advertising on the helicopters, and he was going to work for David and McGee down in New Orleans to try to promote the helicopter business, and he was trying to get me to go down there. And I at that time I wasn't much interested. After coming back from Alaska, I thought I would probably still stay and fly that airplane for Stewart. But anyway, I went down to New Orleans to be interviewed with those people down there and see if I wanted to go to work down there. And when I went down there and saw what they were doing with that C-54, they had the big hangar that belonged to Eastern Airlines, and they had half of the hangar leased for their operation, and they had all kinds of cargo in there that they were hauling to Central America. And I thought, well, that would be a good place for me to go to work flying that C-54. And I would then be doing the maintenance on their two helicopters. And they also had a contract that Stewart already had provided for that required flying about 10,000 miles of power line for TVA. So after working in New Orleans for a while, and I did get to fly in that C-54 a couple of times, but they had to. Since they had a partnership with that C-54, one of the partners didn't want to spend the money to get considerable work done on it, and so they sold it to Kirk Kerkorian. And we had to move then out of that big hangar in New Orleans. We moved out east to a place called Michoud. And there was an airfield out there and a big hangar that people that used to build boats down there in New Orleans had owned. And we moved our helicopter operation out there, and during that time we had acquired two more machines. One was a 47B model that we got from Bell Helicopter and put on the power line patrol, and the other one we bought from Joe Jacobson up in won't come to me.
Well, that's okay.
Kansas City.
Kansas City.
Kansas City, Joe Jackson from Kansas City running this machine on a flight school, and we bought this other machine from Joe Jacobson, and it was a machine that Ong had owned there, and Ong was the original owner of that machine, and he had used it for ag work as well. And then the Korean War came along, and we got forced out of the building we were in New Orleans, and since there were not, places were pretty tight around New Orleans, and then the Allied decided to move back to Oklahoma. Both of these owners were from Oklahoma originally. And so we moved to Tulsa then in 1951. And of course, during this time, I was accumulating hours on these helicopters with the various pilots that we had acquired, and I was gaining a little knowledge all along on the flying part of it. And we moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to a little airport called Brown Airport, and started doing ag work at that time. And we also had another contract in Alaska.
Well, you had a long career with Allied.
Well, that's out these
Almost
people,
5 full decades, right?
They sued me well from January the 1st, 1950, is when I officially went to work for Allied. I was doing work for them prior to that. From about, while I was still working for Stewart, I came down when they put that first ship on the power line. Patrol probably about October, or maybe, about October in 1949. And then I was still run down from Indianapolis and do maintenance on that machine at the same time. And then it was on January the 1st, 1950, that I officially went to work for Allied. Because Allied was formed in New Orleans in October 1949, and that was the official date that Allied was started. Because there was another man that was part of the original group there, and because he'd wanted to get into the business that McGee and David were in, which they call SkyTrain Airways, and with the cargo business, and they wouldn't agree to that, and so they started a separate company called Allied Helicopter Service. And so I went to work for Allied Helicopter Service in January the 1st, 1950. And worked for them until June the 30th, 06. That's the date I retired.
2006. Wow. That's a
So
long,
that's
long
the
time.
time I was working for Roy David.
What are some of the memories that you can remember of your time working for Allied?
Well,
Anything that was that particularly stands out that you're proud of, and that was a high point in your career?
well, we worked up in Alaska. That one year had 2 machines up there working for USGS on the southern part of Alaska, and I went up there in the beginning and set the operation up and helped the crews get started, and then I went back home, and then one of the pilots had an oil failure down around one of the islands and had to land a helicopter in the Gulf of Alaska. Of course, it was on floats, but they tied that thing up, and then they had a storm and had a couple of weeks before they could even pick it up. But anyway, as soon as they had the failure and notified about us, we figured we'd had to get an engine up there. So I got a brand new engine and shipped to Alaska and went along with it to install it after I got up there. And so we brought the machine into Juneau, and I went up there and was going to put the engine in it. And I found out that the other aircraft that we had up there needed an engine more than the one that had the oil failure. And I checked the one over that had the oil pump failure, because all it did was back then the Franklin engine had aluminum oil pump gears, and that is what had failed. And so I took the oil pump off the engine that needed rework, that I was going to replace, and put the new engine in that one, and put a new oil pump in on the other one, or a newer oil pump, I should say, and then we had both machines going again. And I think that was the only time I came back for that trip, but that was a pretty good trip, because airlines went on a strike about that time until I got the machine out to San Francisco, and I had to put it in on a train to get it up to Seattle to get it on another aircraft.
Now, you met Larry Bell, is that right? Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, that was interesting, because I had gone with Stuart in to see Larry Bell, because Stuart was interested in trying to get Larry to help him get the P-39 ready for the 1948 air race in Cleveland. And Larry was reluctant to even want to talk about it, because they'd had problems when they raced it in 1946. They were getting two machines ready for a race in 1946, and Jack Williams got killed in one of the machines prior to the race, because Williams was going to fly one, and Tex Johnson was going to fly the other one. So that when they tried to figure out what had happened to the machine that Williams was killed in, then they went to work on the other machine and riveted some heavy strips of aluminum on both sides of it, and reinforced several things. And of course, later on, I found I heard that they had lost a windshield too on one of those, but I heard that later on. That was something that Jay Deming had talked about in one of his QB interviews, but at the time I didn't know that had happened. But anyway, Larry was reluctant to talk about the race, but he was very interested in selling Stuart a Bell 47 at that time, and Stuart hadn't agreed to buy one until about a year later, or until the following year anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Now, you were flying the Bell 47. How many hours do you think you logged in a Bell 47?
I've got a little over 8,000 hours in a Bell 47 as a pilot, yeah. And about 7,000 hours in airplanes and fixed wing. I've got a little over 15,000 hours total time.
Cool. Okay, I'm told also that you were an A&P mechanic that kept Allied's helicopters flying for all those about 50 years.
Yeah.
What would you tell young people today trying to get into the business?
Well, the first thing they've got to be interested in. It's got to be something they like to do, because otherwise it's hard work. But if it's something they're interested in and they enjoy, then it's fun. Mm-hmm. And I don't guess there's a day that I ever went to work that I hated to go to work. because I enjoyed working on helicopters and as well as flying them, and the same, with fixed wings. During the time that I worked for Allied, especially years later, that we got spread out so far in the ag business that we always had an airplane that we could go to chase parts and get to where we needed to be quicker. And we had a old 195 that flew for about 1,700 hours, and during almost 20 years we had that thing that I chased parts for helicopters. And then when I finally got a 310, and there at the later years I flew a fleet 310 from Florida, South Florida to Michigan, Wisconsin, everywhere we had somebody spraying that needed any help. And flew that thing about 2,300 hours in that length of time. And so it was pretty enjoyable time.
Are you still in touch with any of the people that you worked with at Allied?
Yes, one of my first mechanics that worked with me there in Tulsa is now working for Helicom right there in Tulsa. John Davis Jr., he was a vice president for Omniflight for a number of years, and I think he worked for Evergreen for 10 years before he came up to Omniflight. And I'm still in touch with him. Matter of fact, I called him Dick because his father worked for me too, as an engine mechanic back in Tulsa. And his was John Davis, and so his son is known as John Davis now. I didn't know him as John, I knew him as Dick. And he's still around, and the last fellow that was shop foreman for me he's still there in Tulsa. Still know those people. And there was a little kid or a fellow that I knew in Indianapolis by the name of Ralph Mong. When I came down, when we moved into this little airport there in Tulsa after we came up from New Orleans, well, Ralph was running the airport there. He was managing the airport, and he had been a mechanic up on the airport where when I worked for Stewart in Indianapolis, and I kept our AT-6 out there. Stewart had an AT-6 rigged up for skywriting, and he had a woman working for him in the office as a secretary, and she was a skywriter. And I maintained that machine and flew it at the same time. And when I worked for Stewart, we also did some banner towing. He had we had three N3Ns. Actually, we only had one of them flying that we towed banners. And for advertising these Kaiser Frasers and stuff. And we did some outside work too. I towed a banner around the racetrack there in Louisville when they were having the horse races for 1 year. And that was a lot of fun. But back to Allied, then we got contract with the USGS out in Utah. Went out to Moab, Utah, and with 2 machines, and worked out there all winter. And Ralph Mong worked on that job, and he also worked on that first contract we had in Alaska. I was still in touch with him, and he designed a little midget airplane at that time and sold drawings for it. He designed it himself, just like he was building a model, you know.
Right.
And I flew that thing a couple of times, and and Ralph then, after he left us, went to work for, but then he went to work for American Airlines and retired, and down there in Dallas. And or he's just outside of Dallas. I still talk to him occasionally.
You have a good friend, Howard Hadley, who's president and CEO of Seegers Aero Corporation. Can you tell me about how you two met?
Yeah, Howard, when I first met Howard, we had relocated in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and had bought a part of an airport out west of International, little airport out there called Tulsa North Airport that would belong to an individual. And he sold part of the property to Roy David, who was president of Allied Helicopter Service. And David put up the finances that was required to bring gas and water to the facility, because the fellow that was running the airport didn't have anything like that available. Matter of fact, he was getting some gas off of a gas well there to get a little heat there for some reason, and they didn't have any city gas or nothing like that out there. And David wound up with stocking the airport then to take care of part of that. And then when the Tulsa Police Department there in Tulsa decided to get a helicopter, they started operating out of the airport, which is adjacent to our facility. And Howard was in charge of the unit there, the air unit that they had. They started off with a little Hughes 269 and eventually wound up with a Long Ranger. And that's where I got acquainted with Howard.
Well, the two of you have been coming to all the heli expos, the recent heli expos and everything. And now, you've also, Ozzie, have garnered some awards. One is your honorary life member of the Bell 47 Association, and you're also a member of the Twirly Birds. Is there anything else that...
Yeah, I've been a Twirly Bird member since 1969, and I've been a member of the Quiet Birdman since 1957.
Any other awards that you think of?
No, I can't think of any. It's been a A&P mechanic and an AI. I've had a AI since about 56, somewhere along in there.
I'm told that you could be characterized as being a very polite but humble, reserved pioneer in vertical flight. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that.
Yeah, great. And what else can you think back on that might be some good advice for people wanting to get into this kind of industry?
Well, it's been interesting.
Do you have any words of wisdom for the young people?
Well, I do for helicopter pilots. They need to fly higher.
Fly higher. That's right. Okay. anyways, I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and go back in time with me and to share your experiences with the readers of Rotor Magazine and with the people in the industry. So your history is the history of the association as well. So best luck to you.
Thank you very much.